The ship was already tilting when Emmanuel realized none of them were going to make it to the lifeboats. The water came fast. Not the slow, dramatic kind from movies, but the real kind, sudden and indifferent and cold, flooding every corridor at once. Men were screaming somewhere above him. He couldn't see anything. The lights had gone. He was moving entirely by feel, hands against wet metal walls, feet finding nothing solid, the whole world rotating in a direction the world was not supposed to rotate. And then somehow, he didn't know how, he didn't know why, his hands found a ladder, a maintenance ladder, leading down into the rudder compartment at the stern. He grabbed it. He didn't think. His body just grabbed it the way a drowning man grabs anything that isn't water. Two other men followed him in, Chakotay and Samuel, both coughing, both barely there. The hatch above them sealed with the pressure of the ocean. And in that darkness, in that small metal room at the bottom of a capsized ship, with the Atlantic Ocean pressing in from every direction, Emmanuel heard something. Not a voice, not exactly, more like a line. Something his mother had said over him every morning before school in Lagos. Her hand on his forehead, her eyes closed. He couldn't fully remember it. He couldn't even remember the exact words. But it had something to do with walking, and darkness, and not being alone in it. He didn't know what that memory was going to cost him to hold on to. He was about to find out. The MV Glory had been working the West African shipping routes for 11 years, an aging Nigerian tugboat, the kind of vessel that keeps moving because the men who depend on it need it to keep moving, not because it has any business still being at sea. Emmanuel Ease was 29 years old, a cook on that boat, the kind of job that exists somewhere between crew member and invisible. You feed the men, you clean the galley, you stay out of the way of the people who actually run the ship. He'd taken the job 3 years earlier because the money was real and the work in Lagos wasn't. His mother had cried when he left. He told her he'd be fine. Chakotay was 24, engine room apprentice, built wide and low to the ground, the kind of young man who laughs easily and works harder than he lets on. He and Emmanuel had been friends since the second week of the job, bonded by the particular friendship that forms between men who eat together every day in a small galley and have nowhere else to be. Samuel was 32, deckhand, quieter than both of them. He had a daughter in Port Harcourt who was 4 years old and who he talked about in the specific way fathers talk about young children. Like the child is both the reason for everything and also the reason the stakes of everything are impossibly high. On the night of May 26, 2013, the MV Glory was moving through the Atlantic about 20 miles off the Nigerian coast when the sea decided to change the terms of the agreement. A rogue wave, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that oceanographers describe with words that don't quite fit what it feels like from inside a boat, hit the vessel on its port side with a force that immediately overwhelmed every response the ship could make. The Glory didn't fight it. There wasn't time to fight it. The ship went over. Emmanuel was in the corridor outside the galley when it happened. The world rotated. He ran. He found the ladder. He found the hatch. He found Chakotay and Samuel behind him. And then the ocean sealed them in and the sound above them went from chaos to something almost worse. A deep, pressurized silence, broken only by the groan of stressed metal and the specific sound of water finding every small opening it hadn't yet reached. The rudder compartment was roughly the size of a large closet. Metal walls, no light, no food, no fresh water. The ocean pressing against the hull from outside with a weight that could be felt in the vibration of the walls. The air inside was breathable, barely, and only because the compartment had trapped enough of it when they sealed the hatch. How long that air would last was a calculation none of them made out loud, because making it out loud would have meant thinking about the answer. They sat in the dark, closed together because there was no other option. The water was at their feet, cold, rising slightly, then stabilizing. The metal around them ticked and groaned. Outside, the Atlantic did what the Atlantic does. Moved, pressed, existed in total indifference to three men inside a metal box at the bottom of it. Day one passed in something like shock. Nobody talked much. What was there to say that the situation hadn't already said more clearly? By day two, the thirst started. Thirst is not the same thing as being thirsty. Actual thirst, the kind that builds over days without water, is a physical process that starts at discomfort and moves methodically through pain, through obsession, through a kind of mental narrowing where the whole world collapses down to a single point. You stop thinking about home. You stop thinking about the ship. You stop thinking about whether anyone is looking for you. You think about water. Only water. The sound of it pressing against the hull outside, salt water, useless, lethal, became a particular kind of cruelty. Chukwudi tried drinking the seawater on day 3. Emmanuel stopped him. He didn't have a full scientific explanation ready in the dark of a rudder compartment. He just knew, the way you know certain things without knowing how you know them, that whatever relief it offered would cost more than it gave. Chukwudi was shaking by then. Not from cold, exactly. From something else. The body beginning to understand that the normal rules of supply and demand had stopped applying. Samuel barely spoke. He had gotten quieter and quieter since the first day, in the way that worried Emmanuel more than noise would have. Silence in a crisis is not always calm. Sometimes it's the sound of a man's mind doing something he isn't ready to say out loud. On day 4, Emmanuel started doing the thing he hadn't done since he was a teenager, sitting in his mother's church in Lagos with his arms crossed and his mind somewhere else entirely. He prayed. Not formally. Not with structure or language that would have impressed anyone. Just talking. Into the dark. About his mother. About Samuel's daughter. About Chukwudi, who was 24 years old and who deserved more than this metal room. About the specific and enormous unfairness of being alive and being here and not knowing if any of the people who loved them knew yet that they were missing. He didn't feel anything immediately. He wasn't expecting to. But the talking kept the silence from becoming total. And keeping the silence from becoming total turned out to be its own form of survival. Then on day 5, the memory surfaced properly. Not a fragment this time, the full thing. His mother's voice, every morning, her hand warm on his forehead. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He'd heard it so many times as a child that it had stopped meaning anything. It had become furniture, always there, not really seen. Lying on the metal floor of a capsized ship's rudder compartment with his mouth, so dry it hurt to swallow, and 2 men breathing beside him in the dark. He heard it for the first time. I will fear no evil. Not, there is no evil. Not, the valley doesn't exist. Not, the shadow isn't real. Just, I will fear no evil. While walking through it. While it's happening. While the walls are pressing in and the water is rising and the air is getting heavier and nobody above the surface knows you're down here. He said it out loud. Quietly. Not to Chukwudi or Samuel. Just into the space. Chukwudi heard it. He didn't say anything. But something changed in his breathing. They found a small pipe, a condensation line, that was producing tiny amounts of fresh water. Not much. Barely enough to wet the mouth. Taken in turns, carefully, spread over hours. But it was something. In a situation that had offered nothing for 5 days, something is enormous. Emmanuel had found it because he'd been feeling along the walls in the dark. Moving, searching, refusing to sit still and wait. He'd started moving because the memory had shifted something in him from waiting to looking. He couldn't have explained the connection. He didn't try. Days blurred after that. Time in total darkness without food or regular water stops moving in a linear way. It becomes something else. A series of states rather than a sequence of moments. Awake, not quite awake. The particular half-consciousness that the body moves into when it's conserving everything it has. Voices sometimes, not hallucinations exactly, more like memory becoming audible. His mother, old conversations, things he'd meant to say and hadn't. Samuel talked more as the days passed, which was a relief and also heartbreaking, because what he talked about was his daughter. Her name, what she liked to eat, the way she laughed, the way she reached for him when he came home from a trip. He talked about her the way a man talks about something he's afraid of losing, with the specific precision of someone trying to make it permanent by describing it completely. Emmanuel listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He understood, without it being said, that Samuel was keeping himself alive by keeping her real. On day 11, Chukwudi became very still. Not sleeping, something slower and more concerning than sleep. Emmanuel sat beside him for hours, talking, touching his shoulder, keeping him in the conversation of being alive. The condensation pipe gave what it gave. It wasn't enough. It was something. On day 13, they heard it. Metal against metal. From above. the particular sound of something deliberate, not the random groaning of a stressed hull, not the press of water, but something with intention behind it. Someone was cutting through the ship above them. They didn't shout immediately. For a moment, all three of them just held still and listened, as if shouting might break it, as if it might turn out to be wrong. Then Samuel started banging on the wall with his fist. Hard, rhythmic, the signal of someone who is here, who is alive, who has been here the whole time and would very much like the people cutting through that metal to know it. The cutting stopped. Voices above, muffled, urgent, then more voices. Then the sound of cutting resuming, faster now, with purpose. On day 14, a diver broke through the hull into the rudder compartment and found 3 men alive in a space the size of a large closet, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, having survived without food for 2 weeks and with almost no water for 13 days of that. The diver's name was not recorded in most accounts, but Emmanuel remembered his face, or the shape of it through the diving mask, as the first human face he'd seen in 14 days. He remembered thinking, in the specific clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces, that it was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever seen. Just a face, just another person, just proof that the surface of the world still existed and that there were people on it who had come down here looking. They were brought up one at a time, dehydrated, weakened. Samuel had to be carried. Chikwudi needed help with the ladder. Emmanuel climbed on his own, slowly, his hands finding each rung with the careful attention of a man who has been in the dark for 2 weeks and doesn't trust fast movements yet. When he broke the surface and felt actual sunlight on his face for the first time in 14 days, he stopped. Just stopped, there on the deck, with men around him trying to help him move and give him water and do all the things you do for someone who has just come back from somewhere they weren't supposed to survive. He held his face up toward the light for a moment and didn't move. He wasn't thinking about anything profound. He was just feeling the sun, the specific, unremarkable, everyday sun that he hadn't thought about once in the 3 years he'd worked that route. Just letting it land on his face like it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. Which, in that moment, it was. All 3 men survived. Against statistics that gave them no reasonable chance. Against a situation that had no designed exit. Against 14 days of dark and thirst and the particular weight of not knowing if anyone was looking. His mother found out her son was alive on the same day the rescue made international news. She had spent 2 weeks in Lagos with her Bible open on the kitchen table, her hand on a specific page, her lips moving every morning. She never stopped. Not once. She said later she didn't know why she kept praying past the first day when the ship was reported sunk with no survivors. She just felt like stopping would have been wrong. Emmanuel called her from the hospital in Lagos 3 days after the rescue. She picked up on the first ring. He said, "Mom, I'm here." She said, I know. I never stopped talking to you." He didn't tell her about the memory, about the valley and the shadow and the 5 words that had moved him from sitting still to searching that wall and finding the pipe that kept them alive. He didn't need to. Some things don't need to be explained to the person who put them inside you. They already know.